This is Rabbanit Sarna and Rabbi David Wolkenfeld. Shalom and welcome to the Straw Hat. We are the official podcast of Anshe Shalom B'nai Israel Congregation, an Orthodox synagogue in the beautiful Lakeview neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois. This week's episode will feature two segments and an interview. Our first segment will be a discussion about the 10 Commandments featured in this week's parsha. Our second segment will be about birth control, and we'll have an interview with our very own board member, Elana Pentelnik. So in this week's parsha, we have some really famous events, one of which is Har Sinai, the 10 Commandments, etc. But the 10 Commandments is a little bit of a misnomer.
Yeah, there aren't 10 of them, and they aren't commandments.
And when we do want to talk about commandments, we have 613 of them.
Yeah. So let's unpack that a little bit. So in Hebrew, they're called in Hebrew, they typically refer to as the Seret HaDibrot, but in the Torah, they're called the Seret HaDvarim, but that's maybe for a different time. Yeah. 10 statements, 10 utterances, right? Utterances, I don't know what that is, other than the thing of which there are 10 of in parsha Yitro and parsha Hanan. They don't neatly correspond to commandments. If you just read it and count all the distinct mitzvot, and you might get 12, you might get 8. There are lots of different ways to divide those verses and count distinct mitzvot. You're probably not going to come up with 10. 10 is the statements, not necessarily the commandments. Just perhaps one of the most philosophically interesting ones that comes is like the Anochi Hashem, I am the Lord your God. Is that a commandment, or is that just a statement?
Hello, my name is...
Yeah, right? So according to Rambam, that's a commandment, a very important one. According to others, it's not. Chaskai Kreska says it's not a commandment. Many other just readers of the Torah don't think that's a mitzvah. It's just a statement. It's an introductory statement or something like that, but not a specific commandment. And it starts from there and continues. What's a command? What's not a command? How many commandments are contained in each of these dibrot?
And then, in addition to that, I think there's sort of the question of what is their place. We live in this culture where the 10 Commandments is very important, in part because of Christians who feel that the 10 Commandments are very important. But I wouldn't necessarily say that the prohibition on coveting your neighbor's donkey is more important than the prohibition of not sleeping with your sibling, or whatever, of mitzvot that appear elsewhere in the Torah.
Right. So that's also, I think, an open question, right? I think, certainly the narrative presents the giving of these tablets with these 10 statements is a big deal. It seems the revelation of these 10 statements seems to be significant and maybe different in some way, more, smoke and thunder, right, than some of the other revelatory moments in the Torah.
But you could say, right, that it's not about the content, it's about the revelation itself, the experience, the mass theophany. I think until now, you have the Jewish people kind of seeing what God can accomplish. You have the splitting of the sea, you have the Mako plagues, but you don't have them speaking kind of directly or hearing directly from God. You have them getting mitzvot already. You have all the mitzvot relating to the man. You have HaChodesh HaZelach, right? You have the calendar coming down as a mitzvah. You have the Korban Pesach coming down as a mitzvah. So you have communication between God and the people already mediated through Moshe, but you don't have God speaking directly to the people until this moment, and really from this moment ever again, more or less.
Correct. So that's a difference, and there are some Rishonim who say that the other mitzvot of the 10 statements are archetypes of mitzvot, and the subsequent mitzvot, certainly maybe the mitzvot in Parshat Mishpatim, are all the elaboration and details of the mitzvot on it. So I don't want to go too far in this. Oh, they're all the mitzvot are the same. There's nothing special. It's just a Christian invention. It comes from somewhere, and there are Jewish readings of Sefer Shemot where these 10 statements are significant and paradigms or archetypes or something, where certainly the presentation of these tablets is special and a big deal. And we know from the Mishnah that at one point in time, the earliest Jewish liturgies had the recitation of the Seret HaDibrot as part of like daily, you'd say the Shema, and you would say the Amidah, and you would read the Aseret HaDibrot.
Right, so that happened in the Beit HaMikdash, that the Kohanim would recite the Aseret HaDibrot. And then the Talmud kind of discusses, well, in Brachot, we saw this in Daf Yomi a couple weeks ago, well, we should do that too. Like, that sounds good. The Aseret HaDibrot are great. And the answer is no, because there are minim, that there are heretics who will say those are like the main thing and everything else is kind of secondary to it or not as important. So that's kind of a big deal. Like, it's so important not to overly glorify the Ten Commandments that we don't put them at any point into our tefillah. However, there is a custom to recite them privately every day. So they're in the Siddur kind of, I think usually after Alinu and all of that stuff every day you can have, there's all these things you're supposed to like say every day, and the Ten Commandments are one of them, but we never recite them as a community. But it like cuts the other way when you think about sort of synagogue architecture. We have at least reference to the Ten Commandments, not fully kind of spelled out, around our own Kodesh, and many synagogues do. Which
makes sense, because the original tablets were put in the Beit HaMikdash, so our synagogues...
In the Aron.
Yeah, so the iconography makes a lot of sense. I think that tension is really, like, it's very dramatic. They are foundational to an awful lot of Jewish religious life and Jewish ethical life. But we don't want to, give implicit support to a Christian, maybe, reading of the Torah where there are only 10 commandments, where all the other mitzvot of the Torah have been abrogated or superseded or no longer necessary, and just these 10 commandments. That is anathema to a Jewish sensibility. There are 613 mitzvot, not 10. And so I agree, like referring to the 10 commandments as though there are only 10, aside from the imprecision in calling them the 10 commandments, it also, I think, implies the 10 commandments, and that's it. That's what this book has, just 10 commandments. And of course there are 613. Also, I just want to say, like, we should just mention, like, if you were to open the Torah and, I give you a $50, gift certificate to the, kosher restaurant of your choice. If you can, like, open a chumash, if you can open a chumash and a pad and pen and write down the 613.
But there was a whole time in Jewish history where that was the whole genre.
We have a tradition from Rav Simlai in the Gemara that there are 613 mitzvot, and then we have, like, several centuries of really, really intense scholarship taking that tradition. Oh, there are 613 mitzvot, and then, oh, really? So tell me what they are, okay? And, like, to actually read the Torah and come up with 613 is not a simple task, because the greatest minds of the Jewish people for like 400 years, battled mightily over determining just what was and what was not one of these 613 mitzvot.
Right, and some of it, it's really cool actually, that whole project. So like some of it is in these like very, very long form verse at a time, like at the end of the Gaonic period when Hebrew poetry was really in vogue. So you have some countings there. Some of our earliest halachic works are countings of the mitzvot, and an amazing thing that shakes out also is that, like, so let's say the Rambam writes a Sefer HaMitzvot, and then the Ramban, instead of writing his own Sefer HaMitzvot, which I guess is not necessary once the Rambam has his, he just, like, cuts some out and replaces them with new ones.
Because everyone's committed to that number of 613, and so...
So if I'm going to say, no, you think that's not one, but I still need to get back up to 613.
Right, so anyone he takes out, he puts one in, anyone he puts one in, he has to take one out, and it's a short one-line, passage in the Talmud. There are 613, based on gematria. Like, it's not, it's not, doesn't seem like a very, like, particularly ancient tradition, but, like, there it is in the Talmud.
Really grabbed onto
613,
it, yeah.
and so everyone else, like, feels really committed to that, and so they're gonna make sure their list also has 613.
But it's, like, really, like, the idea that in order for the Ramban to say there's a commandment to settle in the land of Israel, let's say, he needs to, like, delete
which
one.
Rambam doesn't list, right?
Right, he needs to delete one from Maimonides' list. Yeah. It's like it's kind of an aggressive thing because it puts then a limit on mitzvot also. And that's the sort of, like we always feel like, oh yeah, just like add it on, whatever, the more the merrier. And it's like, no, once you have 613, you can't just keep adding. Like that's
actually very, in terms of like recommended books or like things to study, like to go through the list of mitzvot that Ramban adds is really cool. If it's like less than 10, I think, right? But it's
well, and he has commentary. He adds in comments on the Rambam.
Yeah, it's a great it's a great sefer, but particularly to read the ones, his list of the mitzvah and descriptions of the mitzvot that he feels Rambam left out. I think it's kind of cool to see what they are and how he advocates for them. I think is a neat learning project, or somebody's looking for a learning project. I don't know that exists in English. Oh, maybe is it in Chevelle? I don't know. It may not be in English, but it's
There's
Reason number
also
17 to learn Hebrew.
wow, 17. That's high on the list.
The Ramban is, I think, the top 20. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And there's also just if you ever want to say like, what's a good time to set aside to read through a Sefer Mitzvot? So I had friends who decided to read through Maimonides' whole Sefer Mitzvot on Shavuos night, and they like start to finish. You could. If you move really quickly and start on the earlier end, you can get through all of that.
And don't take really long, like, pie breaks or something.
Oh yeah, don't talk about it very much, because 613 is a pretty big number.
That's a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
So we see this all kind of coming to play in shul whenever the Aseret HaDibrot, the so-called 10 commandments, so-called 10 so-called commandments are read, where there's a very old custom to stand, because that's how they were given. That's how we receive them at Sinai, and it's kind of dramatic that way. Everyone stands.
And when it's 4 a.m. in Shavuos, it's important, because otherwise you're asleep.
Yes, or 10:15 on parsha Yitro.
Yeah.
But there are others who say no, like don't treat any verse in the Torah differently. And if you sit when the rest of the parsha is read, you should sit for this. So if you stand for that, you're also giving this like ammunition to this heretical idea. There are only 10 commandments, and only these verses are sacred and divine and authoritative, etc. And we wouldn't want to do that. And so some people insist on sitting even for these verses where I think the overwhelmingly majority custom is to stand, and I always announce, like my resolution of this conundrum is to
stand for all Torah readings.
Yes.
For the whole year.
Which before I started that, I used to also get drowsy. So that solves a lot of problems.
We stand for Shirat Hayam also in Mishalach, and you weren't here this week to give your normal spiel. So I thought of you, and then I was like, I can't pull this off. So I was like, all right, they'll get it next week.
I'm glad I was missed.
Anyway, so come to Shul, here are the 10 commandments, decide in advance whether you want to sit or stand, or you can do like a halvesies crouch thing.
and then count the commandments. That's like your like assignment for the Sarah. Count the commandments.
So I've had the privilege of being what they call it a LEAP fellow at the Herbert Katz Center this year, where they bring in clergy from synagogues around the country, and we get to study with scholars who are working at the Katz Center this year. It's an institute for advanced Jewish studies. And there's a new book that just came out by a scholar at the University of Pennsylvania. She's a sociologist named Melissa Wild. And it's about birth control legalization in the United States and which religious groups were she calls them early liberalizers, like early ones to support it, and tracks the relationship between religious groups that were early liberalizers, early supporters, and their support for eugenics. And
wow.
And it's really crazy. And like the most amazing thing also, or I thought like a really cool factoid was that the American, I forget what it was called, like the American Eugenics Society or whatever it was, would actually like really encourage religious groups to be involved in eugenics. And they would hold competitions for sermons that you could like send in to the Eugenics Society, and they would like publish best like eugenics sermon of the year.
Wow. So eugenics, just let's define our terms, right? Sure. This is the agenda of trying to improve humanity by making sure that like the best people, however you define that, have more children, and the worst people, however you define that, don't have as many children. And in practice, this ended up kind of just reinforcing racial and class stereotypes where wealthy, educated white people were sort of seen as the best kinds of people and were encouraged to have more children, and everyone else was encouraged to have fewer children as a way to like end up with a better humanity, right? So this was I'd say a widely discredited sort of way of seeing the world, especially after Nazism. I think the whole, like nobody, well, I don't say nobody, but I think at least for several decades, nobody called himself a eugenicist.
And the American Eugenics Society just closed up shop. Like they fell off the face of the earth also. Yeah.
But I guess in the early 20th century, it was like this was seen as this great progressive kind of movement. To, like,
and Margaret Sanger worked with them directly. It wasn't like she was like, oh, I'm so separate from the eugenics movement. She was like, I'll take support from whoever.
Because birth control was not about empowering women or couples or family planning. It was about like, let's help these undesirable people have fewer children so they don't become a menace to society when they grow older or something.
Exactly. And like, who are these undesirable people? They're like Orthodox Jews who are coming to America and having a whole bunch of children, and and Irish people and Italians, and they all get written about like very explicitly in ways that are just like really horrifying in retrospect.
And early 20th century, is that right? Is that when you were talking about? Yeah, wow.
Yeah, early 20th century, like the 20s, yeah. And what's interesting about what Professor Weil does is she says, like, you might have thought it would be connected to suffrage, that like if you are pro women's suffrage, you would also be pro birth control. And she says that like really doesn't, for religious groups, that does not correlate at all. And like the highest correlation is eugenics and birth control, which is just like really, really interesting. So not only does she like show that this is a trend, but she shows that other things that might have been obvious are not trends, and that it's basically a combination of eugenics and social gospel. And if those two things were something your religious group was into, then you were pro birth control legalization.
Fascinating. So which groups were pro birth control in the early 20th century?
So the as Jews reading this book, the most standout one is the Reform movement.
Fascinating.
Yeah, really fascinating. And one of the things that struck me, you know how like when you see a group portrait that you're in, you always like only focus on your own face.
Sure.
That's sort of like a phenomenon in the world. She's a sociologist, so her book is full of charts, and so she includes Orthodox Judaism in all of her charts just as like a foil to the Reform movement and the conservative, and she shows how like conservative Judaism eventually becomes very publicly pro-birth control. And one of the things that I noticed is that in her book, she never recognizes Orthodox Judaism as being kind of pro-birth control. And that was really striking to me because most Orthodox Jews that I know like use birth control. So like how did that cut? So I thought we could talk a little bit about our perspectives on birth control and why it might seem to an outsider like no one, the Orthodox Jews, they just have infinite children.
Right. So maybe we'll like sort of narrow that scope of that conversation, because I'd say birth control in Orthodox sociology and birth control in halakha, these are both, I think, topics beyond the scope of this podcast. Maybe we can sort of narrow it and just talk about just maybe how is it that, yes, Orthodox Judaism encourages, mandates even procreating and having children, and I think people are encouraged, I think, the Torah encourages people, I believe, to have children and multiple children, but birth control use is ubiquitous, either for spacing reasons or for family planning reasons, and so that's also true.
Yeah. I definitely remember that when people my age were getting married, which is ongoing and not so long ago, it was always sort of like, don't ask that rabbi about birth control, do ask this rabbi about birth control. But then I had all these friends who went to Stern College and studied with Rabbi Moshe Kahn, and what he would tell them is, you don't need to ask a rabbi about birth control. And he is published on this he just writes really beautifully about this subject, because it's actually kind of an interesting halakha.
He's a lovely person. Do you know him? And
I've met him.
He was Sarah's teacher at Drisha, and so he's been a influence in our lives for a very long time, and that I think that published article you're alluding to about birth control was, I think, motivated by sort of counter messages that were being delivered to his students by other influential rabbis who adopt that approach of, when you get married, you speak to the rabbi who tells you can have 6 months, or you can have 2 years, or you can't have any time at all, and you have to try to have children right away from marriage, and that's absolutely essential. And Rav Kahn's approach is really quite different, based on some very, I think, convincing, compelling reads of classic tshuvot, that it's not the rabbi's role to intervene in these very personal decisions of couples figuring out when and how they're ready to have children.
Right. So his article has two main parts. One is, do rabbis get involved? And two is, what is even the nature of the mitzvah of procreation? So certainly, as you mentioned, there is a mitzvah to have children, but it's not a time bound. It's not like on Sukkot you have a child, like the way that we have other time bound positive commandments of like on Sukkot you'll take lulav and etrog. And so there's not so many mitzvot that you have to do them actively, but there's no
expiration
timing.
date. There's no expiration date.
The expiration date is your expiration,
right? More
or less, right? No, but that's in some of the earlier literature. It's like, you have to have children right now because you could die tomorrow. And he's sort of like, okay, like, this is the 21st century. Let's like breathe a little bit on that one. And then to say, okay, so like, yes, at some point in your life, like, you should not delay this indefinitely, but it does leave, like, that category of mitzvot is very interesting and does leave open a good amount of freedom. And so then when people go go to rabbis, this is kind of like part 2. What's not happening is the rabbi saying, I read this in this text, and therefore I think you have 6 months of using birth control. Instead, what's happening is the rabbi saying, I am the ultimate assessor of your life and the arbiter of wisdom about like when to best have children, and therefore I will inform you what is right for you. And he's sort of like, that is not an appropriate role for rabbis to play, and that actually the people who know their lives the best are the people living them. And there's all sorts of literature about rabbis taking a step back from getting involved, for example, in who marries, or within limits, but who marries whom, for example, or when people get married, and other things like that. And that this should go into that category of things where, like, even if rabbis are asked, they should say, that's a decision for you to make.
And then the role for the rabbi or whomever is offering that advice can be one of sharing values and share, like, I think that's appropriate for a rabbi to encourage, or whoever to encourage, as you think about your life goals for the next 20 years, like children should be high on that list, not secondary or tertiary on that list. I think that's an appropriate, like, kind of values intervention that rabbis can make, where appropriate, in our communities. And we see that. I actually had a conversation recently with somebody who is friends with a lot of religious Jews, but lives in a mostly like kind of secular neighborhood of New York City, and she and her husband have 2 children and don't know anyone else in their neighborhood, who have more than 2 children, but except for like all of her like religious Jewish friends and relatives who all have more than 2 children. And that's like an interest, and she feels like torn between those 2 cultures, and those are cultures. And I think that that's an appropriate role for the people influencing our Jewish culture to kind of weigh in and to advise that to couples. It's very, very different from saying, like, I give you this dispensation. I stamp on this form.
Dispensation to 6 months after you're married.
Yeah. And I think, and it actually prevents the kind of values conversation from taking place if it just becomes a, like this sort of magical like power that rabbis have to sort of allow you to do this thing which otherwise you couldn't do, which seems to not be. I don't think that's what the halacha is suggesting. Rabbi has wrote an article on this topic in which he made the comparison to the. That's sort of one little piece of scaffold, right? The mitzvah of procreating is understood by Chazal, by the rabbis, to be a mitzvah incumbent on men that obviously women are very, very necessary for, but it's a man's mitzvah. And let's say the man, we don't tell men, at your bar mitzvah or when you turn 18, go out and like marry the first person who'll say yes, to, and start having children. It's considered very, very routine and appropriate, and like obviously the right thing to do to wait until you find. Like the right one who will agree to it. I remember actually, it's funny, Rabbi Riskin said this to us when I was like 18 years old. He says, to find someone to marry, like they'll line up to marry you, but to find the right person, you have to line up to, whatever. So, right, to find the right person with whom you can be a successful parent and like successful life partner, that can take some time. And it's routine to spend years or a decade or more until you find that person. And for all of those years, you're not involved in this mitzvah. You're putting off this mitzvah of having children. So if you finally meet her and she wants to finish law school, right, that's entirely right. That's, or whatever it is, or she doesn't feel, she wants to stabilize, the relationship with, 12 months or 24 months of married life before having children. That really is not that's just a variation on the theme. It's not a different category, right? If, you wouldn't ask a rabbi like, oh, is it permissible to wait to get married until I find somebody I like? No one would say that. No rabbi would say you have 6 months. Like, that's just not, that's absurd. And it's similarly absurd to then go back to the rabbi and have to say, I found her, but she wants to finish law school or whatever. And I think Rabbi Lau made that point. I think it's very, very convincing. I sort of one final, like, sort of whatever, I feel like I have some emotions on this. I once had a conversation with a very, very learned woman who, at the time was a student at Stern College, and she shared the advice that was shared among students. Also, like, don't ask this rabbi, don't ask that rabbi. If you ask this rabbi and you cry when you speak to him, he'll definitely give you an extra 6 months.
It becomes like manipulative.
It's just a distortion of the halachic system. It's a sign of just total lack of trust, and value misalignment. That if I tell this rabbi I want to finish law school, or like I'm going to finish residency before I start having children, whatever, like that there's going to be no I don't trust that my values and my priorities for life are going to be like understood and accepted and received with sympathy by the rabbi. So instead, I just have like this out of fear for what I know, like what I want for my life, but also like I'm going to like find somebody who will like again like put his name on the dotted line because that's what I need. It's just I don't think that's not halacha being a source of guidance, a source of wisdom. It's not. It's just
once you know what someone's going to say, do you even have to ask like what's even the point? Like, why are you having a conversation?
Yeah, it was a very disturbing. I don't know if it still happens. This was a long time ago when I heard this. And,
I feel like it for sure still does.
I suspect it does, and I think it's a really problematic distortion of like what halacha should be about. It's not. Again, not providing wisdom, not providing guidance. It's just people are manipulating. The rabbi feels like takes for himself the prerogative to decide this like very intimate choice about a couple's future, and then in turn the students are kind of manipulating the system to like kind of figure out how can they get what they want out of this process, and it's a real. It's
not so unusual for manipulation in this world to be met with manipulation.
Right. That's totally true. But what's missed, what's lacking is actually like maybe there could be a conversation of like maybe not the Rosh Yeshiva who met you 6 months ago, but maybe like the congregational rabbi who knew you since you were a child to say, listen, actually, it's okay to have a child while you're in law school. Like I would really encourage you to like don't have a child until you're ready, but I want to encourage you to like not to push this off too long because et cetera, et cetera. Like I think that's a role that I think like rabbis can say to say like no like having children and like raising children should be
something you see as possible and like a connector, like, oh, I know this person who was at this prestigious law school who managed to have a child while they were in law school. Like, can I connect you? And like opening up worlds of possibility that someone might not have seen otherwise. I think that's another kind of helpful way to that a rabbi could be in the world.
Yeah. I heard once from Rabbi. His book you're teaching in Shul. I was in his shiur when I was at the Gush for most of that year, and his father, also Rabbi Bick, was a congregational rabbi in Washington Heights, and he many years ago complained that it was always the Rosh Yeshiva who would perform the weddings, and then when the marriages failed, they would go back to the congregational rabbis to like pick up the pieces and try to sort things out. And he sort of felt there was like a little bit of an imbalance there.
Yeah, totally. So the other piece of the conversation about birth control that I thought we should just mention is that obviously there's many different kinds of birth control, and I feel like actually over my time here I've gotten a good number of questions of can I use this type, can I use the other type?
Sure.
And there's some as birth control technologies develop, they've had some like funny ramifications across the Jewish world. So for example, there's a type of IUD called a Mirena, and it's completely halakhically permissible to be used, and many women have them inserted after they've had once they've decided I've had my however many children, I don't want to have any more, presumably in conversation with their spouse they've come to that conclusion. And when women are on the Mirena, many women don't menstruate really at all, which means that even through years where you would be a regular mikveh user, where you're not on any birth control, because the birth control means you're not using the mikveh as often, mikvahot across the country are feeling like a financial crush.
Mikvahot that had been sustained by users paying fee for service,
exactly,
are now suffering because the women are really only using the mikveh for the months when they're trying to conceive, and when they're not trying to conceive, the birth control method they're using, even hormonal birth control pills, right? If you depending how you use them, right? They're not using them as often. That's really interesting.
It's just like a funny byproduct of the pervasiveness of birth control in our community, and that's how you really like see just how many people are using birth control, is that there's like financial ramifications for these essential Jewish institutions. Because also nobody who gets a Mirena is like, and I want the mikveh to fail.
Of course, right?
Of course not.
It means we have to think of new funding models for these institutions. I just saw. Rabbis used to be paid per shaila.
I saw that also. Yes, someone was writing about that. For
chicken shilas. You'd bring your chicken to the rabbi, you'd look at the lungs, I guess, whatever, check it out, and you'd give him a quarter, and that was so. Mm-hmm. So that's also whatever a model that whatever, has no longer seems to be, applicable. But,
Yeah, but for the non-members who ask us questions, you should consider it. But the other thing I just wanted to say is sometimes people have concerns about types of birth control that will lead them to not have their periods because they're sort of like, well, there's this like whole area of halakha that it basically sidesteps you from.
Oh, no.
Right. So, but it's a logical thought.
Yeah.
But similarly, we don't say it's prohibited to be a vegetarian, even though it sidesteps you from all the rules about meat and milk.
Right. Vegetarians also have to have two sets of dishes.
just to have
when they use and when they never use.
Exactly. But it's like a funny thought, right? Like, there's like this whole area of halakha that like I'm kind of exempting myself from because I don't menstruate anymore. Yeah. And so people feel like guilt about it, which I think is interesting and like beautiful in a certain way. Yeah, but like it's not a relevant consideration in your birth control journey.
No, and two things. I understand that when the hormonal birth control was invented, they put in the placebo pills that cause menstruation just for
like religious organization.
I
heard it was pressure from the church. What did you hear?
I thought just like that the women would feel like more authentic or just feel like more natural that they're still having something akin to menstruation by having placebo pills. I think it's akin to, when they like the cake mixes, the first cake mixes.
Yeah, you didn't need eggs, and then people felt like they weren't cooking.
So like break an egg, crack an egg. Like they could put the egg in the powder also. They have powdered eggs. They could just put the powdered egg in. But like if you crack the egg, then it feels like, okay, I'm baking. And then you feel comfortable serving this to your guests or for a kid's birthday party because I broke an egg. So
I would say like women don't love being compared to cake mixes.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'm comparing the pharmacologist to
the pharmacologist or the cake mix. All right, fine. But the other thing I was...
Sorry, can I go ahead? While you're thinking of what you're going to say, the other thing, but we see from halachic literature that menstruation used to be much less common than it is in modern times from the assumptions that the halachic codes make about a nursing woman, a woman after childbirth doesn't menstruate again for 2 years.
2 years.
And that's that's a chazaka, right? And it seems that nutrition was really poor and like the body took a long time to recover from pregnancy and childbirth. And so that also a woman who has a child like every 2 to 4, like just she wouldn't be, she'd be pregnant or post-pregnant for many of the otherwise mikveh using years, and so that also meant that I don't know how mikvahs were supported financially in like the 14th century, but it suggests that the monthly menstrual cycle is actually a product of the like modern nutrition that we
totally. I did just want to mention while we're talking about this that sometimes people hear like, I take the pill and then I'll just start skipping months and it'll work perfectly. A lot of women do not react well to that. They'll spot through it. It just doesn't, it makes them not feel good. So we kind of like, I feel like in the like world of people who keep halakha, it's like, and then you just like skip a month and it's totally normal. I just want to say it's totally normal that everyone's body reacts differently to that. And
your mileage
for some people it works and some people it doesn't work. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with you if you like start spotting when you're trying to skip a month, all of that. And certainly like different kinds of birth control work differently for different people. But if you are thinking about changing up what type of birth control you're using or whatever, so there are certain like halachic elements to keep in mind. So for example, many people, if you get a copper IUD, will spot a lot with a copper IUD. And that can be really challenging for Hilchot Nida. So that's just something to consider. But there could be reasons why a copper IUD would be the right thing for you. And therefore, like that should maybe, we'll figure out together how to make that work. And then the other thing is certain types of birth control that like sit on or inside your body, but that are like not just hormones that you swallow or something that's like totally sitting inside your uterus, right? But yeah, like so the patch or there's a loop thing, I forget what the actual name for that is called, that like sits inside your vaginal canal. So some of those, navigating that and going to the mikvah can also be a little bit of a challenge. All of these challenges can be overcome, but those are just some things to think about in terms of making birth control choices. And then I would also say like there's, the decision, sometimes people feel very pressured to use hormonal birth control and they don't want to for whatever reason. Around the wedding, like, just to make sure you're not going to be nida at your wedding, like just go on the pill, even just for a couple of months. And women feel like, I have to do that. And I don't think that is like a a way to think about halakha that I love. Like I don't know what halachic problems need to be resolved by hormonal, synthetic hormonal solutions. I think if using hormonal birth control is something that you want to do and you think is right for you and for your spouse and whatever, amazing. Using a diaphragm is also an effective form of birth control. It does not involve synthetic hormones that can in fact have ramifications for your body, and for different people react differently to them. And there's no reason, meaning, let's say you're nida at your wedding, so of course there's repercussions to that, but there's anytime you're nida for the rest of your life, there's going to be a way that feels, and it's okay. And if that is something that is like creeping up in your life, you can come talk to us about it, and we will not pressure you to take birth control in order to figure out how to navigate it. So anyways, birth control is really, really interesting. And as you're making decisions about it, if you have any questions, of course, come and talk to me or you. I don't know whether you get questions like that.
Absolutely. And so does
Sarah's
Sarah.
Also, yes. And I was going to say Sarah's very much in this world and available as well. We are here in Sunsky Studios with Elana Pentelnik, the newest addition to the Anshe Shalom Board of Directors. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, Elana actually sent us the first voice note as a response to an episode. We were super thrilled about that. So thank you.
Yeah. I was driving and I just got really excited about what you were saying, so I had to record myself to respond.
You could, if you're listening to this and you want to make it meta, you could like send a voice note to Elana about how enthusiastic you are about her interview on the Straw Hat. I think that would be really appropriate. Anyway, so Elana, you're involved in all sorts of things in the show, which we're super grateful for, obviously. I thought we could just talk about some of them. So anyone who reads the back of the bulletin would know that you are one of the chairs of the Young Professionals Committee.
Yes, I've been doing that, I think, now for maybe 2 years, I think so, 2 years.
At least 2 years, because you were doing it by the time I got here.
Time flies, but yeah, I think I've been doing it for over 2 years now.
And how did you get pulled into that?
So those who know Ann Levinson, there was like thoughts that she was leaving, and so I was actually, I think a month into living here, I was asked to do it, and I was like, no. I was like, I just got here, so no thank you. But then like months later, Ann Levinson was leaving, or so we thought. So I was asked to join, and I thought, yes, everything in my past has led me to here. So
everything. What in your past specifically has led you to this moment?
Well, I was very involved in USY when I was growing up, and I was membership Kadima board. I was the president of my chapter, and I was on the all that membership and involvement type things I was involved in.
Gotcha. That's fun. We love USY board members here. I feel like our show is full of them. That is awesome. And so you were well trained for synagogue volunteering opportunities and leadership.
Yes. My father was president of the shul that I grew up in, and both my parents helped start Chavaras and Minions growing up. So I think I've just been always known to be actively involved wherever I'm at.
That is awesome, and we very much treasure that about you. Are there any YP moments that you feel really proud of?
Well, we got tablecloths, reusable tablecloths, and that was really cool. That's just the amount of plastic tablecloths that we're not using is very exciting to me. Also, we've just had some very big meals that are really fun, and I think just cool. When you have people that say, oh, this has gotten me involved, just meeting this person or things like that, those stories mean a lot.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I want to talk about the tablecloths in a second, but how many people come to a normal YP meal? If I'm not a YP, I think I would probably have no idea.
On the small side, it's 40, but we've definitely gotten 60, maybe. I think once we got 70, but that was really extreme. But I'd say between 50 and 60.
Okay, amazing. And then they're usually followed by an own egg somewhere.
Yes. So if you have a big apartment and are a young professional, we are always looking for hosts. But we do have some great people in the community that offer up their homes. And so after a meal, we go to their place and, snacks and drinks, and just sometimes there's singing that takes place. Sometimes it's just socializing, really whatever happens. It's a really great time.
And those are about once a month.
Yes. So the next one is the 28th. Of February, so sign up.
And you guys get actually good food, too.
Yeah.
I think the only time I've had tacos Gingy was at a YP meal.
It's so delicious.
It really is delicious. Okay, so let's talk about tablecloths. You are very invested in environmentalism, and you got some tablecloths for the shul, which we use now not only for YP meals, but for other events. Shabbat Table use them. We used them at the post-up party recently. So you can, count up the number of plastic tablecloths that were saved by these. Are there other environmental initiatives that you want to maybe tell our listeners about?
Yes, definitely. Well, first I want to thank Ava Madoff and Ann Levinson because they helped in getting the tablecloths, and that was very nice to have a committee on board with getting that change. But so recently over Sukkot, we started this initiative. Paired up with Laura Slutsky. I think there's some other people involved in helping. We actually did this trial with the YP committee. We do meals over Sukkot in the sukkah, potlucks, and that way nobody's left out and everybody has a meal together. It's really amazing, a really, really fun time. And so we were like, this time we're going to do all composting for all the meals. And I think there's at least 6, maybe 8 meals. There's a lot.
A lot of meals.
So a lot of meals where we could, get all the leftover food, and instead of plasticware and plastic plates, we were able to get all of those as compostable goods. And some of the members of the shul here, we already compost with the compost club through Urban Canopy. So we just reached out to them and tried this trial to do composting. And that was pretty successful. And since then, we've been trying to figure out what are the next ways that we can take more sustainable steps in the shul to help represent those values as well as, the other ones that we hold here. So we've been trying to figure out if we can do composting at the shul, but that's still, we're taking steps. We're working with Daniel Shayat and Mona Frieden to see if we can do that. Laura and I actually have a call tomorrow with Hazon to see, get advice from them, some steps we can take. Maybe it's not all composting for everything, but maybe there's some steps and advice. That's what they're there for. And maybe even get some grants, and we might try fundraising at the shul to make some of these steps for those, who are passionate. Do you
have a sense of how much it would cost to turn everything over to compostables and to get the compost picked up?
We do.
That's great. Seems like you don't know it offhand, so that's fine.
Exactly.
Anyone interested can get in touch with Elana.
Yeah, so we've definitely calculated it, worked with Steve and Daniel, and it's great to see their support in seeing about maybe making a trial here. But I think first we're going to talk to Hazon and just get their advice because that's what they're there for. So that'll be really great to hear.
And that would be a great partnership for the shul in general. Yeah. They're a wonderful organization. And then one initiative that I do think is exciting and already has action is the upcoming Mishloach Manot are going to be a little bit different this year.
Yeah, so Erica Phillips reached out, which was really exciting. She heard that, I was trying to bring some more sustainable efforts to the shul, and she asked about Laura and I helping with some ideas for the Mishloach Manot. So they already did amazing steps last year of putting the Mishloach Manot in reusable bags. And this year we are making sure that all the items are local. So we got, should I reveal?
I don't know. I don't know whether it's a secret or not.
I don't know.
Well, let's keep it a secret just in case. But you can look forward. It's really exciting. Yes. And you'll probably learn about some new local kosher companies that you maybe haven't heard of until now.
Exactly.
One of which I had not heard of, and I Googled it today and was very rewarded by what I found.
We're leaving everyone on such a suspense.
I know. All I'm saying is once you get this Mishloach Manot, be interested in what's inside of them.
And the bag, it's very exciting. We're looking at different bags or different other ways that we could, put them together. And it was just very exciting. Even we get the pretzels from Windy City every year. So we're getting compostable, biodegradable, instead of plastic bags. Yeah, the baggies. So.
Ah, cool.
Yeah. So it's very exciting to see other people who are excited by trying to take these sustainable steps.
Yeah, I mean, we're all hoping that the planet doesn't, fall apart. So I feel like having a leader who we can turn to say, we're excited about this kind of thing, please, tell us what to do.
Yes.
I think we're really grateful that you've taken up that role and leadership in that way. So thank you.
Yeah, of course.
So we always ask people when we have them on the podcast, if someone in shul is listening to this podcast and says, well, Elana sounds awesome. Where do I find her? I would like to meet her. What are some places where you can be found?
I am in the 5th from the back row, and I'm usually next to Laura Slutsky and Carly Salinger. So
if you know who those people are, you can find Elana.
But I'm probably the third or fourth from the mechitza. That's
Okay. Yeah. And if
also,
that
like,
wasn't
Kiddush.
helpful to you, I can always direct you Elana's way.
I'm also like at Kiddush. You can see me there. And yeah, I'm also just around.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of The Straw Hat. As always, thank you to our producer, Haley Leventhal, for making everything about this podcast happen. Thank you to Elana for coming in and being interviewed. And thank you for listening. If you love what you heard, feel free to, of course, send us a voice note or write a note out by hand and pin it to our door or send it by carrier pigeon or an email. That would work too. And if you didn't like what you heard in this episode, you should definitely sponsor the shul's composting and then compost your comment. And you should write it on compostable material. Have a wonderful week. Thanks so much for listening.